It started with the small things, the kind of changes you notice but don't want to believe mean anything. Maria and I had been married for 12 years, raising two beautiful children, Max and Lily, in a life that was more steady than extraordinary. Our routines were well-worn and comforting: breakfast together before rushing out the door, evenings spent catching up on the day's events, weekends filled with soccer games and trips to the park. It wasn't a perfect life, but it was ours. Maria had always been my anchor, her energy grounding me in ways I didn't realize I needed. Where I was cautious, she was adventurous. Where I was practical, she brought a spark of spontaneity. We balanced each other, or so I thought. But over the last few months, something had shifted. She'd become harder to reach, not physically, but emotionally. There was a new distance between us, subtle yet undeniable, like a wall she was quietly building. At first, I chalked it up to work stress. Maria had recently been promoted at her marketing firm, a role that demanded more hours and travel. Late nights at the office weren't unusual, nor were the occasional business dinners. But as the weeks passed, her absences became more frequent, her explanations less convincing. It wasn't just the late nights. It was the way she carried herself. The warmth that once defined her interactions with me had cooled, replaced by something restrained, almost guarded. Her phone habits were the first concrete sign. Maria had always been casual with her phone, leaving it lying around on the kitchen counter or nightstand without a second thought. But lately, it was glued to her hand. She'd angle the screen away from me whenever she texted, and if I happened to glance her way, she'd quickly close out of apps or change the subject. "It's just work," she would say with a tired smile. "Everyone's pulling long hours lately. It's exhausting." Her tone was reassuring, but it wasn't enough to quiet the nagging doubt in my mind. The first time I felt real suspicion was on a quiet Wednesday evening. Maria was in the kitchen, stirring a pot of marinara sauce on the stove while scrolling through her phone with her free hand. It buzzed softly, and I glanced over instinctively. Her lips curved into a small smile as she read the notification, her thumb quickly swiping across the screen. "Who's that?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. Maria looked up, startled, before quickly recovering. "Oh, just the girls. We're planning a weekend thing. You know, wine tasting or something." Her answer seemed plausible enough, and her smile was convincing. But as she turned back to the stove, I noticed how quickly her body language changed. Her shoulders stiffened, her movements becoming more deliberate. It was subtle, but it lingered with me long after we sat down to dinner. Over the next few weeks, the changes became harder to ignore. Maria started dressing differently, swapping her usual yoga pants and t-shirts for tailored blouses and dresses. She joined a new gym, and her evening workout stretched longer than ever before. When I asked her about it, she shrugged and said she just wanted to feel healthier. "That's great," I said, forcing a smile. "Maybe I should join you." Her laugh was light but dismissive. "You hate the gym, Ryan. Remember the time you almost passed out on the treadmill?" We both laughed, but the conversation left me uneasy. It wasn't that I minded Maria taking care of herself. I loved that about her. But there was something new in the way she carried herself, like she was preparing for an audience that wasn't me. The first major red flag came one Saturday afternoon. Maria had left her phone on the nightstand while she showered, something she hadn't done in weeks. My curiosity got the better of me, and I picked it up, my hand trembling slightly. To my dismay, it was locked. This shouldn't have bothered me. Everyone locks their phone these days. But Maria had never used a lock before. It was a small change, but it felt monumental. I set the phone back down quickly, guilt twisting in my stomach. I told myself I was overreacting, that there was a reasonable explanation, but the knot in my chest wouldn't go away. That evening, as we sat on the couch watching a movie, I decided to bring it up. "Hey, I noticed you put a lock on your phone. Everything okay?" Maria hesitated for a fraction of a second before smiling. "Oh yeah, it's just a security thing. Work's been hammering us about data breaches, and I figured it was time to get with the program." Her response was reasonable, even thoughtful. But the way she avoided my gaze as she spoke sent a chill down my spine. The unease reached its peak 2 weeks later. Maria told me she was meeting friends for dinner, something she rarely did. I stayed home with Max and Lily, enjoying the chaos of popcorn-filled laps and their favorite animated movie. Around 9 p.m., I sent her a quick text. Hope you're having fun. Let me know when you're heading home. The message sat unread. By midnight, my concern had morphed into frustration. I called her phone, but it went straight to voicemail. When she finally walked through the door at nearly 2 a.m., her cheeks were flushed and her hair slightly disheveled. How was dinner? I asked, keeping my voice even. Great, she said quickly, slipping off her heels. We lost track of time. Kara was telling us about her latest dating disaster, and we couldn't stop laughing. Her explanation was perfectly reasonable, even charming. But as she kissed me goodnight and disappeared into the bedroom, the faint scent of cologne hung in the air, a scent that wasn't mine. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with possibilities. Was I imagining things? Was I being insecure? Or was there something Maria wasn't telling me? The next day, while she was out, I sat in the living room and stared at my laptop, debating my next move. Finally, I gave in. I downloaded a tracking app and synced it to her phone. The guilt was immediate and overwhelming, but I couldn't ignore the gnawing need to know the truth. For the next few days, I watched her location obsessively. Everything seemed normal: work, errands, the gym. But on Thursday evening, the app pinged her location at a restaurant across town, far from her office. My chest tightened as I stared at the screen. That night, Maria came home smiling, her voice cheerful as she told me about a long day at work. But as I watched her move around the kitchen, I felt a distance between us that hadn't been there before. For the first time in 12 years, I didn't recognize the woman I had married. The restaurant where Maria's phone had pinged wasn't one we had ever visited together. I knew every restaurant she loved, every place she had begged me to take her for a date night. But this place wasn't on her list. It wasn't even close. It was a sleek, upscale spot across town, tucked into a corner of the city where street lamps cast soft halos over cobblestone sidewalks. My stomach twisted as I stared at the glowing on the screen. I told myself it was innocent. Maybe it was a work dinner, or maybe her location had glitched. The app wasn't perfect, after all, but my rationalizations felt flimsy. I knew better. There were too many inconsistencies, too many moments that didn't add up. The late nights, the locked phone, the faint whiff of cologne that clung to her skin like a ghost. And now this. That night, as Maria slipped into bed beside me, I forced myself to remain still. Her breathing was soft and even, a rhythmic sound that once comforted me but now felt foreign. I stared at the ceiling, my chest tight with questions I couldn't yet bring myself to ask. The next day, I couldn't focus on work. My clients' voices blended into a dull hum as my thoughts spiraled. I replayed every interaction with Maria over the past few months, searching for clues I might have missed. Had she been unhappy? Had I been too distracted, too complacent? Or was it something else entirely? Something beyond my control? That evening, I decided to confront her. My hands trembled as I set the dinner table, the sound of plates and silverware clinking against wood louder than usual. Maria breezed into the kitchen, humming softly to herself. She looked radiant, her hair falling in loose waves over her shoulders, her cheeks flushed from the gym. For a moment, I hesitated, the weight of my suspicions pressing down on me. "Hey," I began, my voice tighter than I intended. "Can we talk?" She paused, her smile faltering. "Sure. What's up?" I hesitated, my mind scrambling for the right words. I feel like we've been out of sync lately. Like there's something you're not telling me." Maria's brow furrowed, and she set down the glass of water she had been holding. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," I said, forcing myself to meet her gaze. "You've been distant. The late nights, the locked phone. It feels like there's something going on." Her expression softened, and she reached across the table to take my hand. "Ryan," she said gently, "I'm sorry if I've made you feel that way. Work has been overwhelming, and I guess I haven't been as present as I should be. But there's nothing going on. I promise." Her words were soothing, her tone sincere. But as she squeezed my hand and offered me a reassuring smile, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was lying. The following week, Maria told me she was going to an industry networking event downtown. The explanation felt rehearsed, her tone too casual. As she kissed me goodbye, I noted the extra effort she had put into her appearance. A fitted dress, bold lipstick, her hair styled to perfection. It wasn't unusual for Maria to dress up, but tonight, it felt calculated. After she left, I paced the living room, my thoughts racing. I opened the tracking app, watching as her location moved steadily across town. As expected, she stopped at the same restaurant. I grabbed my coat and keys before I could second-guess myself. The drive to the restaurant felt interminable, each traffic light stretching into eternity. By the time I arrived, my heart was pounding so loudly I could barely think. I parked a block away and walked to the restaurant, the cold evening air biting against my skin. The restaurant's windows were large, offering a clear view of the elegant interior. My breath caught as I spotted Maria almost immediately. She was seated at a table near the corner, laughing softly. Across from her sat a man I didn't recognize, tall, impeccably dressed, with dark hair that fell just slightly into his eyes. They leaned in close, their conversation animated, their body language intimate. I felt like the ground had shifted beneath me. I stood outside the restaurant for what felt like an eternity, watching as Maria reached across the table to touch the man's hand. He smiled, his gaze lingering on her face in a way that made my stomach churn. The easy familiarity between them, the unspoken understanding in their gestures, told me everything I needed to know. I wanted to burst into the restaurant, to demand answers in front of everyone. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the fear of what I'd say, or maybe it was the realization that I didn't want a public scene. Instead, I turned and walked back to my car, my chest heaving with anger and disbelief. When Maria came home that night, her smile was easy, her demeanor as warm as ever. "It was such a good event," she said, slipping off her heels. "I made some great connections. You should have seen the setup. They really went all out." Her lies felt like acid, burning through the fragile remnants of my trust. I nodded mutely, unable to summon a response. Later, as she slept soundly beside me, I opened her phone. The tracking app had provided plenty of evidence, but I needed more, something concrete. To my surprise, her passcode hadn't changed. My hands trembled as I scrolled through her messages, stopping at a thread labeled Andrew. The texts were explicit, their tone casual yet intimate. They spoke of longing, stolen moments, and promises that made my stomach twist. The timestamps matched her late nights, her networking events, her dinners with friends. Each word was a dagger, cutting deeper than the last. I set the phone down, my vision blurred with unshed tears. The betrayal felt overwhelming, suffocating. I stared at Maria, who slept peacefully beside me, her face serene and untroubled. It was as if the weight of her lies didn't exist. "Why?" I whispered into the darkness. "Why would you do this to us?" The only answer was the steady sound of her breathing, a rhythm that once brought me comfort but now felt like a cruel reminder of the distance between us. The next morning, Maria acted as though nothing had changed. She kissed me goodbye before heading to work, her smile bright and cheerful. I watched her leave, my chest heavy with questions I wasn't ready to ask. For the rest of the day, I avoided thinking about her, throwing myself into work and mundane tasks. But the messages lingered in my mind, each one replaying like a broken record. By evening, my resolve hardened. I couldn't keep living like this. I needed answers, even if they destroyed everything we had built. As Maria came through the door that evening, her face lighting up at the sight of Max and Lily, I realized something chilling. The woman I loved was gone, replaced by someone I no longer recognized. The days that followed were a blur of forced smiles and hollow conversations. Maria continued her routines, her demeanor as radiant and composed as ever. But I couldn't look at her without hearing the words I'd read in those messages, the way she called him Andrew. Each syllable burned into my mind, a cruel mockery of the trust we had built over 12 years. I tried to hold it together for Max and Lily. Their laughter, their bickering, their constant need for snacks and attention. They were the only threads tethering me to reality. But even they couldn't shield me from the crushing weight of my suspicions. Every time Maria kissed them goodnight or smiled at me across the dinner table, I wondered how much of it was a lie. One evening, I sat alone in the living room after the kids had gone to bed. The house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards and the faint hum of the refrigerator. Maria was upstairs, her voice drifting softly from the bedroom as she spoke on the phone. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, warm, intimate, the way she used to speak to me. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms. The anger I'd been suppressing for weeks boiled to the surface, an intense, suffocating heat. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to confront her, to hear her say it out loud. When she came downstairs a few minutes later, her smile was easy, her steps light. "What are you doing up so late?" she asked, her tone casual as she leaned against the doorway. I looked at her, my chest tight. "Maria," I said, my voice shaking slightly, "we need to talk." Her smile faltered, and she crossed her arms over her chest. "Okay, what's going on?" I took a deep breath, forcing myself to meet her gaze. "I know about Andrew." Her reaction was subtle, a slight widening of her eyes, the faintest hitch in her breath. But it was enough. In that moment, I saw the truth written all over her face. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said quickly, her voice defensive. "Don't," I said, my tone sharper than I intended. "Don't lie to me, Maria. I've seen the messages. I know where you've been going." She opened her mouth as if to argue, but no words came out. Instead, she looked away, her hands clenching at her sides. The silence stretched between us, heavy and oppressive. "How long?" I demanded, my voice trembling. "How long has this been going on?" Maria sank into the armchair across from me, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of her secrets had finally become too much to bear. "A few months," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Her admission hit me like a physical blow. I leaned back, struggling to catch my breath. "Why?" I asked, the word escaping me like a plea. "Why would you do this?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stared at her hands, her fingers twisting the hem of her shirt. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "I don't know," she said. "It just happened." "It just happened?" I echoed, my voice rising. "You don't accidentally end up at a restaurant with another man. You don't accidentally send him texts about how much you miss him." Maria flinched, her eyes brimming with tears. "I didn't mean for it to get this far," she said. "I was just... I don't know, Ryan. I felt lost. I felt invisible." Her words cut deep, stirring a mixture of anger and guilt I wasn't prepared to face. "Invisible?" I repeated, my voice shaking. "We have a family, Maria. We built a life together. How could you feel invisible?" She looked at me then, her expression raw. "Because somewhere along the way, we stopped seeing each other," she said. "We got so caught up in the kids, in work, in everything else, that we forgot about us. I wasn't looking for this. It just filled a void I didn't even realize was there." Her confession left me speechless. Part of me wanted to scream, to lash out, to throw the hurt back at her. But another part of me, a quieter, more vulnerable part, wondered if she was right. Had we lost each other without even realizing it? That night, Maria slept in the guest room. I lay awake in our bed, staring at the empty space beside me. Her absence felt both jarring and fitting, a stark reminder of the chasm that had grown between us. My mind replayed her words, her tearful admission, the way she looked at me when she said she felt invisible. I hated that a part of me understood what she meant. The next morning, the air between us was thick with tension. Maria avoided my gaze as she poured coffee, her movements brisk and mechanical. Max and Lily, oblivious to the undercurrent of emotion in the room, chattered excitedly about their weekend plans. I forced a smile, nodding along to their stories, but my heart wasn't in it. After breakfast, Maria pulled me aside. "We need to figure out what we're going to do," she said softly. "About us. About everything." Her words sent a chill through me. "I don't know, Maria," I said, my voice strained. "I don't know if there's anything left to figure out." She looked down, her shoulders slumping. "I'll stay at my sister's for a few days," she said. Give us both some space." I nodded, unable to find the words to argue. As she packed a small bag and kissed the kids goodbye, I felt a strange mixture of relief and sorrow. For the first time in weeks, the house was quiet, too quiet. In the days that followed, I tried to make sense of what had happened. I replayed every moment of our marriage, searching for the cracks I hadn't seen before. Had I been too focused on work? Had I taken her for granted? Or was this simply who she had become? A woman I no longer recognized? Andrea's name lingered in my mind like a shadow. I knew I wasn't ready to confront her directly, but part of me wanted to know more. Who was he? What did he have that I didn't? The questions gnawed at me, each one cutting deeper than the last. One evening, I sat at the kitchen table with Maria's phone in front of me. She had left it behind, whether intentionally or by accident, I didn't know. I hesitated for a long moment before opening the messages again. There were no new texts from Andrew, but the old ones were still there, each one a testament to the bond they had shared. As I scrolled through their conversations, I noticed a recurring detail, mentions of a cafe near his office, where they often met for lunch. I made a decision then, one that felt equal parts desperate and necessary. I needed to see him, not to confront him, but to understand. The next morning, I drove to the cafe and waited, my heart pounding as I scanned the faces of every man who walked through the door. I sat in the cafe, my hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The place was modest, with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu, but it buzzed with the energy of downtown. Young professionals on laptops, baristas shouting out orders, the faint hiss of steaming milk. I had no idea what I was doing there. Part of me felt foolish, like a child playing detective in a game far too complicated to win. But another part of me, the part that couldn't let go of the betrayal burning in my chest, needed to see him. Andrew, the man Maria had chosen over me, the man she laughed with, confided in, shared parts of herself that I hadn't seen in years. I didn't know what I expected to find. Answers? Closure? All I knew was that I couldn't move forward without facing the source of my pain. I spotted him almost immediately. He walked in just after noon, tall and self-assured, his suit tailored perfectly to his lean frame. He exuded a quiet confidence, the kind that turned heads without trying. My stomach churned as I watched him order, his smile easy, his demeanor warm. This was the man Maria had risked everything for. He sat at a corner table, pulling out his phone and scrolling idly as he sipped his coffee. For a moment, I hesitated, unsure of how to approach him. But then I thought of Maria's messages, the way she spoke to him with such familiarity and longing. The anger bubbled up inside me, overriding my fear. I stood and walked over, my heart pounding in my ears. "Andrew?" I asked, my voice tight. He looked up, surprised. "Yes? Can I help you?" I sat down without waiting for an invitation, my hands trembling slightly as I clenched them together on the table. "I'm Ryan," I said, watching his expression carefully. "Maria's husband." For a split second, his composure faltered. His eyes widened, and he leaned back slightly, as if putting distance between us might undo my presence. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said quickly, his voice calm but unconvincing. "Don't," I snapped, my tone sharper than I intended. "Don't lie to me. I know everything." He stared at me, his jaw tightening. "Look," he said, lowering his voice. "I don't think this is the place for—" "I'm not here to cause a scene," I interrupted, cutting him off. "I just want to understand. Why her? Why my wife?" He hesitated, glancing around the cafe as if searching for an escape. But when his eyes met mine, something shifted. He sighed, leaning forward slightly. "It wasn't supposed to happen," he said. "We started talking at work, just small stuff, you know? Venting about our jobs, our lives. It wasn't anything serious at first. And then it was," I said, my voice flat. He nodded, guilt flashing briefly across his face. "I didn't plan for this. Neither of us did. But sometimes things just click." His words felt like a slap, a cruel reminder of the connection Maria had shared with him, something I hadn't been able to give her. "Do you love her?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. Andrew hesitated, His expression conflicted. I care about her, he said finally. But love? I don't know. It's complicated. Complicated. The word felt hollow, a weak excuse for the devastation they had caused. I stood abruptly, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. Stay away from her, I said, my voice low and firm. Whatever you think this is, it ends now. He didn't argue. He simply nodded, his gaze falling to the table as I walked away. The drive home was a blur, my mind racing with the weight of the encounter. Confronting Andrew hadn't given me the closure I'd hoped for. If anything, it had left me more confused, more uncertain about what came next. I couldn't stop thinking about his words, the way he described his connection with Maria. Had I failed her? Had I been so blind to her unhappiness that she sought comfort in someone else? When I arrived home, the house was quiet. Maria's absence was palpable, a reminder of the space she had put between us. I wandered into the kitchen, pouring myself a glass of water and leaning against the counter. The silence was oppressive, the weight of my thoughts suffocating. My phone buzzed, jolting me from my spiral. I glanced at the screen, my stomach flipping as I saw Maria's name. Her text was simple, "Can we talk?" That evening, she came back to the house, her face pale and drawn. She sat across from me at the dining table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. For a long moment, neither of us spoke, the tension between us almost unbearable. I talked to Andrew, I said finally, breaking the silence. Maria's head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock. You what? I needed to see him, I said, my voice calm but firm. I needed to understand why you did this. Her eyes filled with tears, and she looked away. Ryan, I'm so sorry, she whispered. I never meant for this to happen. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. That's what he said too. But that doesn't change the fact that it did. She nodded, her tears spilling over as she wiped them away hastily. I don't know how to fix this, she said, her voice trembling. But I want to. I want us to be okay. Her words stirred something in me, a flicker of hope, buried beneath layers of hurt and anger. But I wasn't ready to forgive her. Not yet. I don't know if we can be, I said honestly. I don't know if I can ever trust you again. Maria's sobs grew louder, and she buried her face in her hands. I sat there, watching her cry, my own emotions a tangled mess of love, betrayal, and resentment. I wanted to comfort her, to hold her and tell her everything would be okay. But I couldn't. Not now. After Maria left that night, I found myself staring at the family photo on the mantel. It was taken 2 years ago on a beach vacation, Maria laughing, Max and Lily covered in sand, and me grinning like a fool. We looked so happy, so whole. I wondered if that version of us still existed somewhere, or if it was just an illusion, a fleeting moment that had already slipped away. For the first time since the affair came to light, I felt a flicker of something unfamiliar. Hope. Not for Maria and me, but for myself. For Max and Lily. For the possibility of a future where the weight of betrayal no longer defined us. The morning after Maria left, the house felt unnaturally quiet. The absence of her presence, once a comfort, now left a hollow space in the rhythm of my day. Max and Lily seemed to notice, their usual chatter subdued as they ate breakfast. I wanted to shield them from the chaos swirling around us, but there was no denying the cracks forming in our carefully constructed world. Is Mom coming home soon? Lily asked, her voice small as she pushed her cereal around the bowl. I hesitated, unsure of how much to say. She's staying with Aunt Claire for a little while, I said carefully, but she'll be back to visit soon. She loves you both very much. Max frowned, his expression more skeptical than sad. At 10 years old, he was sharp, perceptive in ways that made me both proud and uneasy. Did you guys have a fight? He asked bluntly. I sighed, ruffling his hair. Sometimes grown-ups have things they need to work through, I said. But no matter what happens, you and Lily are the most important things in the world to us. He nodded slowly, accepting the answer for now. But the doubt lingered in his eyes, and I knew the questions would come back eventually. Over the next few weeks, Maria and I communicated sparingly. Her texts were practical, focused on arranging time with the kids or discussing bills. There were no late-night apologies, no heartfelt pleas for forgiveness. It was as though we had both silently agreed to put distance between us, to let the wound breathe even as it festered. I threw myself into work, using the endless stream of meetings and emails as a distraction. But no matter how busy I kept myself, the memories of her betrayal followed me like a shadow. I found myself revisiting the messages, the moments, the signs I had ignored. Each time, it felt like reopening a scab that had barely begun to heal. One evening, as I sat in the living room with a glass of whiskey, my phone buzzed. It was Andrea, Andrew's wife. "Can we talk?" The message read. My stomach twisted as I stared at the screen. I hadn't spoken to Andrea since I confronted Andrew. I wasn't sure what she wanted, but curiosity, and perhaps a sense of shared grief, compelled me to reply. We met at a cafe downtown, a neutral space where neither of us had any history. Andrea was already seated when I arrived, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug. She looked tired but composed, her dark hair pulled back into a sleek ponytail. "Thanks for meeting me," she said as I sat down. Her voice was calm, measured, but there was a tightness in her expression that betrayed the weight of her emotions. "Of course," I replied, folding my hands on the table. "What's on your mind?" She took a deep breath, her gaze fixed on the swirling foam in her cup. "I wanted to thank you," she said finally, "for confronting Andrew. He told me what happened, and, well, it forced him to be honest with me. For the first time in months, I wasn't sure how to respond. I'm not sure honesty was his choice," I said, my tone sharper than I intended. Andrea's lips twitched into a faint smile. "Fair point," she said, "but still, it gave me the clarity I needed to make a decision." "And what decision is that?" I asked. "I'm filing for divorce," she said simply. The words hung in the air between us, heavy and final. I felt a pang of something, sympathy, admiration, maybe even envy. Andrea's decisiveness was a stark contrast to my own uncertainty. "I'm sorry," I said softly. "That can't be easy." She shrugged, her expression bittersweet. "It's not, but I can't keep living like this, pretending everything's fine. I deserve better. My kids deserve better." Her words hit me harder than I expected. For weeks, I had been consumed by anger and hurt, focusing on what Maria had taken from me. But Andrea's perspective was different, forward-looking, resolute. It made me wonder if I was holding on to something that no longer existed. After our meeting, I found myself thinking about Andrea's decision. Her clarity, her determination. It was something I craved but hadn't yet found. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I realized I couldn't keep avoiding the inevitable. Whether or not Maria and I could rebuild our marriage, I needed to take control of my life. The next morning, I called a lawyer. The divorce process was both simpler and more painful than I had imagined. Maria didn't contest anything. She seemed almost relieved, as though the act of formally severing our ties lifted a weight from her shoulders. The kids were the hardest part. Explaining the situation to Max and Lily felt like ripping my heart out, piece by piece. "Are you and Mom not going to live together anymore?" Lily asked, her big eyes brimming with tears. I pulled her onto my lap, holding her tightly. "No, sweetheart," I said gently, "but we're still a family. That's never going to change." Max sat silently on the couch, his arms crossed. "It's not fair," he muttered, his voice thick with frustration. "I know, buddy," I said, my voice breaking. "I know it's not." As the weeks turned into months, life began to settle into a new rhythm. Maria moved into an apartment across town, and we established a co-parenting schedule that, while awkward at first, eventually became manageable. I saw her less and less, our interactions limited to polite exchanges about the kids. Each conversation felt like another step toward closure, a slow but steady distancing of two lives that had once been intertwined. Andrea and I stayed in touch. Our conversations were sporadic at first, filled with updates about the divorce process and the challenges of single parenting. But over time, they became something more, a source of comfort, a reminder that I wasn't alone in navigating this new reality. One evening, as we talked on the phone, Andrea said something that stayed with me. "You know," she said, her tone thoughtful, There's something liberating about starting over. It's terrifying, sure, but it's also hopeful. Like there's this blank page in front of you, waiting for you to write something new. I didn't respond right away, letting her words sink in. For so long, I had been consumed by what I had lost. My marriage, my trust, my sense of stability. But maybe Andrea was right. Maybe there was something to be gained in the blank page ahead. Months later, as I sat on the back porch watching Max and Lily chase fireflies in the fading light, I felt a strange sense of peace. The scars of Maria's betrayal hadn't disappeared, but they no longer defined me. I was rebuilding, piece by piece, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was moving forward. Andrea's words echoed in my mind. It's terrifying, but it's also hopeful. For the first time, I believed her. A year had passed since the day I confronted Maria. In that time, life had shifted in ways I couldn't have imagined. The wounds from her betrayal were still there, but they no longer bled. They had scabbed over, leaving scars that told a story of survival and resilience. Max and Lily adjusted better than I expected. They thrived on the stability I worked so hard to provide, their laughter filling the house with warmth on the days they were with me. Maria and I found a rhythm in our co-parenting arrangement, though our interactions remained cordial at best. The love we had shared was gone, replaced by a quiet understanding that what was best for the kids would always come first. One evening, as I packed away a box of old photos, I came across a picture of our family on a trip to the mountains. We looked so happy, Maria's smile bright and genuine, Max and Lily climbing over me as we posed for the camera. I stared at it for a long time, feeling a bittersweet ache in my chest. It wasn't regret, not exactly. It was the realization that life was rarely as simple as the moments we captured in pictures. People changed, relationships frayed, and love, no matter how deeply felt, was sometimes not enough. I set the photo aside, resolving to hold on to the good memories without letting them anchor me to the past. Andrea and I continued to stay in touch, our conversations evolving into something deeper over time. What had started as shared commiseration became a source of genuine connection. We talked about everything: our kids, our careers, the small victories that came with rebuilding our lives. Her insight and humor were a balm for my weary soul, and I found myself looking forward to our chats more than I cared to admit. One evening, as we sat on my back porch watching the kids play in the yard, she turned to me with a faint smile. "Do you ever think about what's next?" she asked, her voice soft. I hesitated, swirling the drink in my hand. "I think about it all the time," I admitted. "But it's hard to picture." Andrea nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "I get that. Starting over feels overwhelming, but also kind of exciting, don't you think?" I glanced at her, my chest tightening at the warmth in her expression. "Yeah," I said quietly, "it does." The turning point came on a crisp autumn afternoon. Andrea had invited Max and Lily to join her son, Jamie, at the park. Watching the kids run through the leaves, their laughter ringing out across the field, I felt a lightness I hadn't experienced in years. Andrea sat beside me on the bench, her presence steady and comforting. "Ryan," she said after a long silence, "I know we've both been through a lot, and I know it's not easy to think about opening yourself up again. But I want you to know, I'm here, whatever that means." Her words caught me off guard, but they felt like the truth I hadn't realized I was waiting for. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not just a woman who understood my pain but someone who offered the possibility of something new. "I'm here too," I said finally, my voice steady. Her smile was soft, tentative, but it reached her eyes. It wasn't a grand declaration, nor was it meant to be. It was a quiet promise, one that spoke of patience and hope. As the months passed, our lives began to intertwine. It wasn't a whirlwind romance. Neither of us wanted that, but a slow, deliberate merging of two worlds. We spent more time together, blending our families in ways that felt natural and unforced. Max and Lily adored Jamie, and their laughter became a soundtrack to our weekends. Andrea and I took things one step at a time, always mindful of the complexities that came with starting over. There were moments of doubt, of hesitation, but they were outweighed by the quiet certainty that we were building something worth holding on to. The final piece of my journey came in an unexpected form, a letter from Maria. It arrived one snowy afternoon, handwritten and tucked into a plain envelope. I sat at the kitchen table, my hands trembling slightly as I opened it. Ryan, I've spent a lot of time thinking about what I did, about the hurt I caused you and the kids. There's no excuse for my actions, and I'll carry that regret for the rest of my life. But I want you to know how sorry I am, not just for the betrayal, but for all the ways I let our marriage fall apart. I wish I could go back and fix it, but I know that's not possible. What I can do is thank you. Thank you for being a wonderful father to Max and Lily, for giving them stability and love even when I couldn't. And thank you for the years we shared, even if they didn't end the way we'd hoped. I'll always cherish them. I hope you find happiness, Ryan. You deserve it more than anyone I know. Maria. I read the letter twice, the words stirring a mix of emotions I couldn't fully process. There was no anger, no bitterness, only a quiet sense of closure. For the first time since the affair came to light, I felt a weight lift from my chest. On a cool spring evening, as Andrea and I sat on the porch watching the sunset, I thought about how far I had come. The pain of Maria's betrayal was still a part of me, but it no longer defined me. It had shaped me, yes, but it had also pushed me to grow, to rediscover myself in ways I hadn't thought possible. Andrea reached for my hand, her touch grounding me in the present. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, her voice soft. I glanced at her, a small smile tugging at my lips. "How lucky I am," I said honestly. Her smile widened, and she squeezed my hand. "Me too." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in shades of gold and orange, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. Life wasn't perfect, and it never would be. But it was mine, and it was good.